Welcome back, Life Science learners, to another installment of Life Sciences. Trust that you're well and you're excited about our lesson today. In our lesson today, we're going to be focusing on the abiotic and the biotic factors in an ecosystem. Let's get straight into the concept of the lesson and unpack what biotic factors are. So, as I mentioned, in our lesson, we're going to review some important terminology, and then we're going to spend some time having an overview of the biotic and abiotic factors. It's important that we review some important terminology that is used. So we have come across the word ecology before, and ecology essentially refers to the study of the relationships between plants and animals and their non-living environment in which they live. It's important that we recognize that plants and animals interact with each other, but it's also the non-living environment that we say that influences their existence. So it's important that we recognize the abiotic factors when we study ecology. The next concept is ecosystems, and eco refers to ecology, and systems would be obviously an association. So this refers to the specific area in which the abiotic and the biotic components are interdependent and interact with each other. So essentially it shows you the interaction between the non-living and the living components in their habitat or in their specific area. The concept of abiotic, so biotic refers to living organisms, so the abiotic refers to the organisms that are non-living or the parts of an environment that are non-living. So let's look at that. So the non-living components of an ecosystem that make up the environment. This would include the soil, the climate, temperature, sunlight, and water. And we will unpack that in detail in a bit. The other concept is biotic, and that's quite simple. It's the living components of an ecosystem, and that would include all the organisms that interact and are able to carry out life processes. And then finally, as a recap of the term biosphere, bio meaning the living, and the sphere refers to the earth. So that part of the earth where humans and other organisms are able to live and interact with each other. So the biosphere, we got to remember. So when we talk of the biotic components, again, it's important that we remember that living organisms form the biotic components on the three spheres of the earth. So the earth has three spheres: the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. And those living components that inhabit these three areas are referred to as the biotic components. As I mentioned, the abiotic components were the non-living components, and these would be the constituents of the environment. So it will be the soil, the pH of the soil, the types of soil. It would refer to light. It would refer to the temperature of the area. So these would be the non-living components that influence how these biotic factors or organisms survive. So it's important that we understand that life on Earth gets the energy from the sun, and this space in which the three spheres interact with each other is where life exists. And so we know that, as a recap of the Earth, it's got the lithosphere, which is the soil and its different parts, the air, which would be the atmosphere and the gases that support life, as well as water, which is part of the hydrosphere and how that supports the diversity of life on Earth. And so this is the interconnectedness of the three spheres that we often refer to as when we talk about the biosphere. The interaction between the abiotic and the biotic components is what forms a global ecosystem, and that's what we need to unpack now. So when we talk of the biotic components, we're referring to all living organisms, and these are essentially broken up into the following two main categories. Broadly speaking, we have autotrophic components and your heterotrophs. The concept of autotrophs comes from the word auto, meaning self, or be able to develop or drive themselves. So the concept of autotrophs is derived from individuals that are capable of producing their own food. And your heterotrophs refer to those individuals that are relying on your autotrophs or your consumers. So it's important that we recognize that your autotrophs are your producers. What do we mean by producers? These are the individuals that are able to produce energy in an ecosystem. So energy from the sun, which is light or radiant energy, are used by the producers, in this case plants, that are able to use the carbon dioxide as well as water to produce sugar during the process of photosynthesis. And that is important in also producing oxygen that we rely on as living organisms. It's important that we recognize that there are several different types of autotrophic organisms. We often are associated autotrophs with just plants. Remember, guys, that there are more than just plants that produce their own food. And the ability to produce your own food is a characteristic of being an autotroph. So there are cyanobacteria that have the ability to produce food because they have chloroplast in them. We know that there are certain photosynthetic protists, algae, that are able to produce energy by using radiant energy from the sun. As I mentioned, plants are your autotrophs that photosynthesize. We mentioned algae as we discussed protists. And finally, we also have some chemosynthetic bacteria. And so these are bacteria that are able to use chemicals from the environment to produce energy. So not necessarily using photosynthesis, but using chemicals to produce energy. So we refer to them as, again, your chemosynthetic, meaning that they use chemicals to produce energy, as opposed to your photosynthetic, meaning those that are using light to produce energy. So guys, that's a wrap for this segment. We've looked at your biotic components. We've tried to unpack them in detail. We mentioned specifically in this segment, we refer to the autotrophs, and we discussed that these are individuals capable of producing their own food. Plants being the predominant source of energy on Earth, but it's important that we recognize that there are several other organisms that produce energy, some of which are your protists, such as algae, which live in your aquatic environments, your phytoplankton, as well as your zooplankton. It's important that there are some bacteria that also produce energy, not necessarily using sunlight, but using chemicals from their environment. And so those are your chemosynthetic bacteria. So that's a wrap for this segment. When we get back after a short break, we're going to be looking at your heterotrophs as part of your biotic components. See you in a little while, have a short break, and catch you soon.